Hello and welcome back to the channel if you're returning, and hello and welcome if you're new. My name is Ricky Fraley, and on this channel I like to talk about true crime, at least on a weekly basis. This week's video will be on a man by the name of John List, who was also dubbed the Boogeyman of Westfield. So without further ado, I'd like to get straight into the background of the case. John List was born John Emil List on September 17, 1925, in Bay City, Michigan. List was the only child born to John Frederick List and Alma Barbara Florence List, both of whom were German-Americans. Like his father, List would become a devout Lutheran and a Sunday school teacher. He would find himself enlisting in the United States Army in the year 1943, which, if you know anything about history, you know was a hot time for the army of just about every country on the planet. He would serve as a laboratory technician in the army during that special war. While serving, his father would pass away in 1944 during the war, and as such, not much is known about his father's passing. List would go on to be discharged in 1946 and would follow his career in the military with enrolling at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Here he would earn a bachelor's degree in business administration and then move on to earn a master's degree in accounting and subsequently commission into the U.S. Army as a second lieutenant through the ROTC program. That's the Reserve Officer Training Corps program. In November of 1950, while the Korean War was escalating, List was recalled to active duty service, obviously. And it was here at his permanent duty station, which was Fort Eustis in Virginia, where he would meet a woman by the name of Helen Morris Taylor, the recent widow of an infantry officer who was killed in action while deployed in Korea. Helen and her daughter Brenda lived off-post but near the base together. The two would get to know each other, and eventually they would marry on December 1st, 1951 in Baltimore, Maryland. The Army, which realized List was very skilled in the accounting field, reassigned him to the Finance Corps. List would complete his second tour in Korea in 1952, and he would move on to working for an accounting firm in Detroit, and then as an audit supervisor at a paper company in Kalamazoo. This is where his 3 children were born, in Michigan. His eldest child, a daughter named Patricia, was born around 1955. His elder son and middle child, John Jr., was born around 1956, and his son, who was named Frederick, the youngest, was born around 1958. Official birth dates for the children aren't very publicly accessible, and as such, these are just estimated birth years given their ages at the times of their death. By 1959, he had been promoted to general supervisor of the company's accounting department. However, his wife, Helen, who was now an alcoholic, became increasingly unstable. Brenda, who was Helen's eldest daughter from her first marriage with the infantry officer, would marry and subsequently leave the household, and this would prompt List to move the remainder of his family to Rochester, New York, to work with the company Xerox. Once again, he was promoted, and these promotions would lead to him becoming the Director of Accounting Services for Xerox. 6 years down the line, so 6 years later, List would be offered a position as a Vice President and Controller at a bank in Jersey City, New Jersey, and he would accept this job. This new job allowed him to move his wife and children and his mother with them into Breeze Knoll, which was a 19-room Victorian mansion located on 431 Hillside Avenue in Westfield, New Jersey. So, we're talking about a guy who's making great strides in his career, who is a war veteran of 2 of the wars that America got involved in, and he just became vice president and controller of a bank in New Jersey. So you might be wondering how this all turns around and goes downhill. Well, the answer to that is it happens very quickly. His family, you see, seemed quite perfect, with List being a devout Lutheran. He was very active in his church, and his family resembled the typical American family, the dream, the American dream. The white picket fence and the wealth and the job security and, all the stuff that doesn't actually exist. However, List was seen as somewhat of a religious zealot. He was convinced that he and his family had been living sinful and unholy lives, and coupled with his wife's deteriorating stability, and because of her alcohol abuse, List would grow quite frantic. To make matters worse, he would lose his job at the bank at the age of 46, and none of the jobs that he had lined up for after that ended up working out. The sudden loss of income would weigh quite heavily on List, and he could not bring himself to inform his family that he had lost his job and could no longer afford their comfortable lifestyle. As the bills began to pile up, he was very reluctant to go on welfare, due to his fear of embarrassment within the community and also his fear that he would violate the principles of self-sufficiency that he had learned from his father. He suddenly began to dissociate from reality. He began pretending to go to work every day. However, in reality, he would spend his days at the train station, reading newspapers, and secretly skimming money from his mother's bank accounts to pay for the mortgage on the mansion. This would go on for many weeks, and List was aware that eventually his family would find out and he would be exposed as a failure. This was something that List, the proud Army veteran and former vice president to a bank, self-sufficient man, could never let happen. This led to John List doing something irreprehensible on November 9th of 1971. This day would begin like any other morning for the family. John would calmly take his 3 children to school, dropping them each off, and then would return to the family home where his mother and wife had remained. On his way back home, however, he would retrieve 2 firearms from his car. One, a 9mm Steyr 1912 semi-automatic handgun, and the other, his father's Colt .22 revolver. He would walk inside the family home, approach his wife Helen, who was 46 at the time, as she drank her customary morning coffee, and he would proceed to shoot her in the back of the head. He would then calmly walk upstairs to his 84-year-old mother's room on the 3rd floor of their home and shoot her once above the left eye. Still quite calm, List would leave and go to the post office to stop their mail from coming to that address and pause all the deliveries, which at the time were like milkmen and obviously the mailman, we still have that today, and I believe they had a paper route. So he wanted to pause all the deliveries to that home that happened on a daily or weekly basis. He would then return home and await his children's arrival. Patricia, who was 16 at the time, would arrive first and was shot once in the back of the head. He would repeat this with his youngest son, Frederick, who was 13, when he arrived as well. Somehow, after this, List managed to make himself lunch and would drive to the bank to close both his and his mother's bank accounts, cash out her savings bonds, and then head to Westfield High School in order to watch his son play in a soccer game where he cheered him on from the sidelines. He would then drive John Jr., who was 15 at the time, home, and the boy would put his bag on the kitchen countertop, at which point a struggle would ensue between the two. This struggle ended in List shooting his son multiple times in the face and chest, subsequently killing him. List would place the bodies of his wife and 3 children on sleeping bags in the mansion's ballroom, and would leave his mother's body upstairs in her apartment attic. He would compose a 5-page letter for his pastor, Reverend Eugene A. Rehwinkle, detailing why he committed the crimes. In the letters, he detailed how he feared his family, now confronted with poverty and a world full of evil, would turn from God, and as such, murdering them was the only way to ensure that they would arrive safely in heaven. He would leave his letter on his desk in his study. He would clean the various crime scenes thoroughly and remove his image from every photo in the mansion using scissors. So he would go around and physically cut himself out of the pictures. He would then turn on all the lights in the house, tune the radio to a station that played classical music, and then leave religious hymns to be played in the rooms that were all empty, and leave. Prior to his departure, List had gone through the process of contacting the children's schools and part-time jobs to inform the teachers and employers that the family would be taking an extended vacation. This would prevent any immediate suspicion surrounding their sudden disappearances. He would claim that the children were visiting their ailing maternal grandmother in North Carolina for a few weeks, and while Helen's mother was, in fact, quite ill and had to cancel her planned visit to Westfield, this cancellation might have actually saved her life, as John later stated that had Helen's mother shown up, he would have killed her too. As a result of his post-mortem subterfuge, none of the bodies would be discovered until nearly a month later on December 7th. Remember, this all happened on the morning of November 9th. So, the bodies were discovered on December 7th. This also, the gap in time between their deaths and their discovery also had to do with how reclusive the family tended to be normally. Neighbors would take notice of all the mansion's lights being on, day or night, without seeing anyone coming or going from the house. Soon after the bulbs began to burn out one by one, this would prompt the neighbors to call the police. The police themselves would arrive on the List family home, and after hearing no responses, would enter through an unlocked window leading into the basement, and they would discover the family laid out as List had left them on the ballroom floor. Inside the house, the authorities would find the letter that List had left to his pastor. The nature of the crime would lead to a nationwide manhunt, and police in the following days and weeks would investigate hundreds of leads without any success, primarily due to any reliable photographs of List having been destroyed when he went through and cut himself out of all the photos. The family car would be found parked at John F. Kennedy Airport in New York City, but the authorities at the time could not accurately determine if he had in fact boarded a flight under a different alias, given they had very little information to go on in the first place. You see, unbeknownst to the FBI, their primary suspect had actually fled New Jersey to Michigan and then to Colorado shortly after the murders of his family. He would officially settle in Denver in early 1972, and he would take an accounting job under the alias Robert Peter Bob Clark. List allegedly took this name from one of his college classmates, but the classmate later said that he had never actually met List. Between the years of 1979 and 1986, List would become the controller at a paper box manufacturer just outside of Denver, and subsequently join a Lutheran congregation whilst running a carpool for the shut-in members that didn't really have a way to get to and from church, so he would drive them. What a nice guy. During one of his religious gatherings, he would meet an Army PX clerk by the name of Dolores Miller. The Army PX, if you don't know, that just stands for Post Exchange. It's like a convenience store. Well, depending on the size, there's different sizes of them, but each post has a PX. It's not just Army, it's, I believe, Air Force bases as well. I don't know about Naval and Marine bases, but I know that at least Army and Air Force bases have PXs. And it just means Post Exchange. It's like a convenience store. You can go there, you can get small grocery items. They have all the stuff that you need for your uniform, like name tapes, Army tapes, Air Force tapes, I guess. Sweaters, they've got bedding, just stuff that you would need. They also have snacks, and a few of them have like a small selection of alcohol, but if you want anything crazy, you'll have to go to Class 6 for that. But it's just like a convenience store, depending on the size. So she was a clerk. Sounds by the sound of it, she was a cashier at the PX, and her name was Dolores Miller. The two would begin a relationship and eventually get married in 1985. 3 years later, in 1988, the couple would move into a house at 13919 Sagewood Trace in the Brander Mill neighborhood of Midlothian, Virginia. That was quite the sentence. List, who was still using his alias, Bob, would resume work as an accountant for a small firm named Madrea, Joyner, Kirkham, and Woody. I assume that was a paper firm? I don't know. Or law firm, could be. It was roughly 18 years after the 1971 murders of his own family, on May 21st of 1989, that Fox television program America's Most Wanted would run a segment on the crime, giving a recount of the events that had taken place. It would be during this segment that a forensic artist by the name of Frank Bender would display an age-progressed bust of John List, in the hopes that it might lead to new leads in the case, as the segment had been broadcasted to an audience of over 22 million people. This resulted in tips pouring in from all across the country. One tip in particular led the authorities directly to List. A woman in Richmond, Virginia, thought that her next-door neighbor, Robert Clark, looked oddly similar to the bust. In addition, she noted similarities such as the fact that her neighbor was also an accountant who attended church quite regularly. This prompted the authorities to go to the Clark's residence in order to speak to his wife. On June 1st, List was arrested at a Richmond accounting firm. However, despite his arrest, List was unwilling to drop his alias. He insisted that he was Robert Clark for several months, even after his extradition to New Jersey in late 1989. Later that year, List would finally have to drop his alias, as he had been faced with irrefutable forensic evidence from the crime scene. He would go on to finally confess his true identity on February 16th of 1990. List's attorneys would argue in court that List suffered from PTSD from his military service in both World War II and the Korean War. Meanwhile, expert psychologists challenged this theory and believed that it was more of a midlife crisis than PTSD, and as the prosecution would point out, PTSD wasn't an excuse to murder 5 innocent people, 3 of which were only children anyways. List would also testify at his trial that his financial difficulties had reached an all-time high in 1971 after he was laid off, and that his engagement in the same routines as when he was employed was for the sake of avoiding his family having to share in the humiliation that would have come from being on welfare. This is why List would siphon money from his mother's account in order to avoid defaulting on their mortgage. It also became the central reason why he encouraged his kids to get part-time jobs. This he disguised as wanting them to gain maturity and responsibility, when in reality it was because the man was just broke. List also claimed during his trial that he had to deal with his wife's alcoholism and her untreated tertiary syphilis, which, if you know about syphilis, tertiary syphilis is also called neurosyphilis. That's because that's when the infection gets to your brain and starts to affect your mental capabilities, your mental capacity. It rots your brain meat. He said that he had to deal with his wife's alcoholism and her untreated neurosyphilis. This she had contracted from her first husband nearly 18 years prior, but never got it treated, which is why it progressed to that stage. It takes a while to get there. He claimed that this was why she had pressured him to marry by falsely claiming to be pregnant at the time, and then insisting that the wedding had to be in Maryland, which in Maryland there was no requirement for premarital syphilis tests, unlike in other states where it had already been mandated. Despite Helen slowly getting more ill as a result of the alcoholism and the syphilis, she said nothing to List or her physicians until 1969, when the condition had been revealed through a thorough medical workup to find the root cause of her condition. In List's words, the combination of alcoholism and her tertiary syphilis had, and I quote, transformed her from an attractive young woman to an unkempt and paranoid recluse, one whom List stated would often publicly humiliate him by comparing his sexual prowess unfavorably with that of her first husband. Which, that's messed up, man. That's... Oof. His letter, which was read at trial, also addressed other specific reasons for the killing of his family. It mentioned his daughter, who was a budding actress at the time of her death, and it said, and I quote, being so determined to get into acting, I was also fearful as to what that might do to her continuing to be a Christian. I'm sure it wouldn't have helped. In particular, the very last line of his letter would send an audible gasp throughout the courtroom as it read, P.S. Postscript. Mother is in the hallway in the attic, 3rd floor. She was too heavy to move. During the trial, a court-appointed psychiatrist would testify that List suffered from OCD and only saw 2 realistic solutions to his problem. Either inform his family of their current situation and accept welfare, or kill his family and send their souls straight to heaven. List found the first solution unacceptable due to his fear of ridicule and violating his father's teachings regarding the care and protection of family members, and as such chose the second option, the care and protection of family members through homicide. On April 12th of 1990, John Emil List would be convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder. List, however, would deny any direct responsibility for the killing, stating, and I quote, I feel that because of my mental state at the time, I was unaccountable for what happened. I ask all affected by this for their forgiveness, understanding, and prayer. The judge, however, was unmoved, and would say that, and I quote, John Emil List is without remorse and without honor, and after 18 years, 5 months, and 22 days, it is now time for the voices of Helen, Alma, Patricia, Frederick, and John F. List to rise from the grave. The presiding judge would follow this by imposing a sentence of 5 terms of life imprisonment to be served consecutively. And if you don't know what that means back to back, not at the same time. So the way consecutively works compared to concurrently, if you were serving, say you get 3 10-year sentences. If you serve them concurrently, that means that you are serving all of them at the same time. So you're in there for a maximum of 10 years. 3 10-year sentences, you're in there for 10 years, serving them concurrently. Each year that you're in there counts as a year for all 3 sentences. Consecutively, it means you're serving them back to back, one after the other. So if you get that same 3 10-year sentences, serving them consecutively, you'll be in there for 30 years, because each year only counts on one of the sentences. So they're saying that he's going to spend 5 entire lifetimes in there, which, I mean, at that point, he's going to die in prison. But in terms of justice for each of the 5, it makes sense. List, however, would file an appeal of his conviction on the grounds that his judgment was affected by PTSD and that the letter left behind was inadmissible in court due to its intended confidentiality between himself and his pastor. The federal appeals court would, however, waste no time in rejecting both of those arguments. In an interview he gave Connie Chung in 2002, List would finally express some degree of remorse for his actions. I quote, "I wish I had never done what I did. I've regretted my actions and prayed for forgiveness ever since," he explained. When asked during this interview why List had not taken his own life, he would say that he believed that if he had committed suicide, it would have prevented him from going to heaven, and by extension, prevented him from being reunited with the family that he murdered with his own, not bare hands, but with his own hands. Kind of think that that would preclude you from going to heaven as well, but hey, I'm not him. List would go on to die from complications from pneumonia at the age of 82 on March 21st, 2008, while serving his prison sentence. It was during the report of his death that he was dubbed the Boogeyman of Westfield. While there were no further follow-up reports in 2008, it was being reported that no one had come forward to claim John List's body after his passing. His wife at the time of his arrest, remember the PX clerk, was reluctant to come forward or speak publicly, and with his entire immediate family being deceased at his own hand, it would have resulted in John List's body being returned to the State Department of Corrections. It's unclear if anyone had ever come forward to claim John List's body. And that's where the story of this case ends. He died in prison, and it doesn't seem as if anybody came to collect his body. One thing that I find fascinating about this case, and the reason why I wanted to do it, is because all it took to get him caught after nearly 18 years of being on the run was one well, I don't know how many times it aired before the tip came in, but one episode of America's Most Wanted. And you see, the power of doing true crime like this is that eventually someday what you do can pay off in justice being brought to someone or for someone. That's why in the videos that I do about unsolved cases or unsolved disappearances, I go through great lengths to include photos of the people so that maybe someday when someone watches these videos, they can see it and be like, oh, I recognize that person. And they can put in a tip that can lead to somebody being brought to justice or closure for some family somewhere, just like what happened with the episode of America's Most Wanted that ran here. So with that being said, that's why I'm doing this. That's why I think I will continue to do this, whether or not people watch me now or don't watch me. Eventually somebody somewhere will see this, and hopefully we'll be able to lead to a good outcome. So with all that being said, I'd like to thank you for watching. I'd like to thank you for commenting, liking, and subscribing. And I would like to say a very special thank you to my patrons because they make this all a little bit easier. So until we meet again next week, I would implore you to stay safe. I love you all. Goodbye.